Welcome back to New York, New York, a city that is home to 8.3 million people, with 32,000 streets, 5 boroughs, and 3 major rivers, all coming together to create a city unlike any other on Earth. What makes New York truly remarkable is that almost everything that defines it today, the famous skyline, the cultural landmarks, and the vibrant energy of its streets, did not exist even a century ago. New York's history is a story of constant change, growth, and transformation. Over the years, the city has evolved in ways that are almost unimaginable. But how did this city, which began as a small trading post for Europeans just over 400 years ago, grow into the sprawling metropolis we know today? Let's take a journey through time and explore how New York became one of the greatest cities in the world. Long before the busy streets, bright lights, and towering skyscrapers, the land that would become New York was covered in thick forests, flowing rivers, and full of wildlife. For thousands of years, this land was home to Native American tribes who spoke Algonquin languages. Among them were the Lenape people, who lived in harmony with nature, hunting, fishing, and farming the land for around 8,000 years. Everything changed with the arrival of Europeans. In the early 16th century, European nations like Spain, France, and the Netherlands were exploring the Americas in search of new trade routes and resources. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing for France, became the first European to see the area that would one day be New York Harbor. He claimed it for France, but no permanent settlement followed, and the land remained largely untouched by Europeans for nearly a century. It was the Dutch who left the first lasting mark. In 1609, English explorer Henry Hudson, working for the Dutch East India Company, was searching for a northwest passage to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. During this journey, he sailed up the river now named after him, the Hudson River, and claimed the land for the Dutch Republic. This set the stage for Dutch settlements and trade in the region. Over the next few decades, the Dutch established trading posts along the Hudson River and along the coastline from the Delaware River to Cape Cod, forming the colony of New Netherland. Initially, these settlements focused on commerce, especially the fur trade. But in 1624, the Dutch West India Company sent colonists to create permanent settlements. A small group settled at the southern tip of Manhattan, where they built Fort Amsterdam in 1625 to protect the valuable fur trade and the river entrance. Around this fort, a small settlement grew, called New Amsterdam, the beginning of what we now know as New York City. In 1626, with the goal of legitimizing Dutch claims to the new colony, Peter Minuit, the Director General of New Netherland, purchased the island of Manhattan from a small group of local Lenape people. The trade involved goods worth 60 guilders, roughly equivalent to $1,000 today. This marked the beginning of permanent European settlement in the area. Under Minuit's successor, Peter Stuyvesant, the colony grew steadily, reaching about 1,500 residents by 1655. However, Stuyvesant was widely disliked for his strict policies, which included regulations on alcohol, attempts to control the Dutch Reformed Church, and restrictions preventing other religious groups, such as Quakers, Jews, and Lutherans, from establishing places of worship. The Dutch West India Company tried to introduce more lenient policies, but their plans were interrupted by ongoing conflicts. In the latter half of the 17th century, the Netherlands was locked in fierce maritime and commercial rivalry with England. Between 1652 and 1673, 3 Anglo-Dutch wars were fought on the seas, as both nations competed for naval supremacy. In 1653, the residents of New Amsterdam built a defensive wall along the northern edge of the settlement, what is now Wall Street, to protect themselves from potential attacks by English forces from the north. Despite these efforts, in 1664, the English sent a fleet to capture New Netherland. Stuyvesant was unable to mount effective resistance, and the city surrendered without a fight.
The English renamed Fort Amsterdam as Fort James, and the colony of New Netherland, along with New Amsterdam, became New York, in honor of James, the Duke of York, who later became King James II. New York briefly returned to Dutch control in 1673, but was handed back to the English under the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, ending the hostilities. Under English rule, New York continued to grow, benefiting from a thriving economy and a steady influx of European immigrants. Many Dutch institutions and practices remained, including slavery, which had become a significant part of the city's economy. By the 1740s, about 20% of New York's population, roughly 2,500 people, were enslaved. As the 18th century progressed, New York became a center of political and cultural change. Leading up to the Revolutionary War, the city was a hub for dissent and revolutionary activity. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty organized resistance against British rule, while the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 convened in New York to unite the colonies in opposition to taxation policies imposed by Britain. These early actions helped lay the ideological groundwork for the American Revolution and the eventual Declaration of Independence. During the Revolutionary War, New York remained strategically important. Initially occupied by Continental Army forces in 1775, the city suffered a major defeat during the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, where General Washington's forces were overwhelmed by the British. Following this, New York was occupied by British forces for the remainder of the war, serving as a critical stronghold throughout the conflict.
By 1783, the American Revolutionary War had come to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The British began evacuating their forces from New York City, ending nearly a decade of occupation. This marked a turning point as New York emerged as a symbol of liberty in the newly formed United States of America. In January 1785, New York was chosen as the first national capital of the United States. It became the site of some of the country's most important early events. George Washington was inaugurated as the nation's first president at Federal Hall in April 1789. The first United States Congress convened there, and the Bill of Rights was drafted in the same building, located on what is now Wall Street. As the 19th century began, New York quickly rose as a global center of finance and banking. Lower Manhattan became the heart of commerce, home to the Bank of New York, founded by Alexander Hamilton in 1784, and the New York Stock Exchange, established in 1792. Trade and commerce expanded rapidly, and major infrastructure projects strengthened the city's economic power. One of the most transformative projects was the construction of the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. Linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean, the canal cemented New York's status as the nation's premier port, surpassing Boston and Philadelphia in both capacity and importance. New York's population grew dramatically in the early 1800s, fueled by waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia. People arrived seeking refuge from poverty, persecution, and political unrest, hoping to start fresh and build new lives. By the mid-19th century, the city's population had surged from 60,000 in 1800 to over 500,000. The abolition of slavery in New York in 1827 also brought an influx of freed African Americans into the city. Neighborhoods like the Lower East Side became vibrant centers of immigrant life, with crowded tenements and bustling marketplaces filled with Italians, Irish, Eastern Europeans, and Chinese settlers. However, rapid growth also brought serious challenges. Overcrowded living conditions made the city a hotspot for diseases like cholera, which struck repeatedly beginning in the 1830s. In 1835, the Great Fire of New York destroyed around 50 acres of the city, devastating many tenement buildings. Other poor neighborhoods, such as Five Points and Hell's Kitchen, were plagued by crime and poverty.
Notorious gangs like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys roamed the streets, engaging in theft, robbery, and violent conflicts. These social challenges were compounded during the American Civil War, which began in 1861. While New York State remained loyal to the Union, the city's strong commercial ties to the South, combined with a large immigrant population and resentment over conscription, led to divided loyalties. The New York draft riots of 1863 erupted over anger that wealthy men could pay to avoid military service. The five-day riot became one of the worst episodes of civil unrest in American history. After the war, New York experienced a cultural boom. Central Park, which had opened in 1858, provided a much-needed green oasis for recreation and relaxation. Broadway theaters and Carnegie Hall became cultural landmarks, hosting world-class performances and establishing the city as America's cultural capital. New York also saw the founding of major museums and libraries: the American Museum of Natural History in 1869, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1870, and the New York Public Library in 1895. This cultural growth was accompanied by the rise of journalism. Newspapers such as the New York Times, the New York Herald, and the New York World became major forces in shaping public opinion and the city's identity, cementing New York as a national hub for media and information. As the city continued expanding northward along Manhattan and connecting with towns on Long Island, major infrastructure projects followed. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, was a monumental engineering achievement, linking Manhattan and Brooklyn and symbolizing the city's growth and ambition. By the mid-1880s, New York had begun to establish some of its most iconic landmarks that would define the city's skyline and identity for generations to come, shaping it into the world-renowned metropolis we recognize today. In 1886, the city received a gift from the nation of France that would become one of the most iconic symbols of New York and the United States: the Statue of Liberty. Situated in the middle of New York Harbor, the statue served as a beacon of hope for millions of immigrants arriving on American shores. Many of these newcomers would first pass through Ellis Island, which opened in 1892, before beginning their new lives in the city and the country. The rapid pace of development continued into the 20th century. In 1904, New York opened its first subway line, connecting City Hall to Harlem and Brooklyn, transforming transportation and making the city more accessible. Bridges such as the Williamsburg Bridge in 1903 and the Manhattan Bridge in 1909 further connected the boroughs and enabled the city to expand. At the same time, New York's skyline began to soar. Architects and developers competed to create the tallest, most impressive buildings, giving the world iconic skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, all topped off by the early 1930s. These structures symbolized the city's economic and architectural confidence on a global scale. Below the skyline, New York thrived culturally. Speakeasies and jazz clubs flourished during the Roaring '20s despite Prohibition, when the sale of alcohol was outlawed. The city saw a proliferation of anywhere between 30,000 to 100,000 illegal clubs, where music, dance, and social gatherings continued to thrive. The exuberance of the 1920s, however, came to a sudden halt with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Thousands of New Yorkers struggled to survive, with many building makeshift shanty towns called Hoovervilles in parks such as Central Park, a bitter commentary on President Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for the economic collapse. The city's fortunes began to improve with the mobilization for World War II. Even before the United States formally entered the conflict in 1941, New York became a hub for war production, with factories manufacturing tanks, planes, and ships for the Allies. The city's ports and docks became crucial for transporting goods across the Atlantic. Once the United States joined the war, thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen departed from New York's piers, embarking on enormous ocean liners bound for the front lines. After the war, New York rose to new global prominence. While many of the world's great cities lay in ruins, New York emerged as a center of international influence. It became the home of the United Nations headquarters in 1952, inherited Paris's role as a global art capital, and rivaled London in financial markets. The 1960s saw continued growth, but by the 1970s, New York struggled with high crime rates and urban decay. Efforts to modernize the city led to the redevelopment of older pre-war buildings and the construction of modern glass and steel landmarks, including the World Trade Center, completed in 1973. Since then, New York has continued to face challenges, yet it has repeatedly reinvented itself. The city's resilience, its ability to recover, rebuild, and transform is what sets it apart from almost any other city in the world. Over its 400-year history, New York has evolved again and again, growing from a small Dutch settlement into the sprawling, dynamic, and iconic metropolis we know today. The city's story is one of constant transformation, ambition, and renewal. A city that never stops moving forward, no matter the obstacles. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot and helps us bring you more amazing content like this. Thank you for watching.